offense. You don't count Stivar. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and get going here. He knows I'm just joking, but so our last topic for today before we head out is a concurrent jurisdiction with federal installations. So I guess we'll hear from the military department first, and then we have some folks from down in Cheyenne, both the local representatives and some folks from the active duty component down there. So please proceed, General, or whoever you like with your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Karen Hinkle. I'm a major in the Wyoming Air National Guard, and I'm also the senior legal counsel for the Wyoming Military Department. I'm here to talk to you about everybody's favorite topic, which is jurisdiction. So I'm going to try not to bore you with too much legalese here, but this is a pretty important topic for 90th Missile Wing and also for the Air National Guard. And we'll just kind of dive right into it. The initial problem set for your consideration is that F.E. Warren Air Force Base down in Cheyenne is what we call a federal enclave, and they are covered by exclusive federal jurisdiction. What does jurisdiction mean? It means that the federal government has the sole authority to legislate and take law enforcement actions on any of the property that's within that F.E. Warren Air Force Base. So if there's a criminal issue that comes up, F.E. Warren or the federal law enforcement authorities are the only people that can really respond and address that issue. That's great for certain offenses, but it can create some challenges when you have offenses that federal law really wasn't intended to cover, particularly with juvenile misconduct or with even family member misconduct. And as the base has grown in population, you see a lot more civilian individuals working on the base now than ever before. And you also have a lot of family members who reside on base. Sometimes family members get in trouble, and the federal system is perhaps not the best mechanism to deal with those kinds of issues. So that's really what the purpose of the discussion is today. Concurrent jurisdiction is something that the Department of Defense has been looking at for all of its military bases across the country that have the current exclusive jurisdiction model. And what concurrent jurisdiction means is that the state and the federal government both have the opportunity not only to legislate, but to take law enforcement actions against anything that happens on the base. So if the state was able to get concurrent jurisdiction back over F.E. Warren, essentially it has the ability then to provide services to folks who live on the base that need assistance. It has the ability to provide other mechanisms to resolve juvenile misconduct, such as sending folks to the Boys and Girls School at Worland or using alternate means under our state statutes, which are a bit more robust than what we would see under the federal statutes. The exclusive jurisdiction is an old problem, right? So that the base existed basically before the state became a state, and it wasn't unusual at that time when states ceded territory to the federal government to just go ahead and cede their rights as states to kind of monitor and take care of issues that arose on that property. And again, as we've evolved and developed, the problems that have become apparent through that session are really what we're looking at resolving today. If you were to look at slide number 32, so I've kind of gone through the first parts, and I'm trying to keep this brief because I know there's a tour that's coming up here in a little bit that's very exciting. The biggest driver of this from the Office of the Secretary of Defense is focused historically on the juvenile justice issues. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's just frankly not a great system in the federal law setup to handle juvenile cases. They don't have their own juvenile court. Everything goes through the same kind of adult system, which we call magistrate court. And there's really limited options. If they find that a juvenile has committed an offense, there's limited options that they can assess against them as a juvenile. And it's really limited to restitution, which is basically a payment to kind of make everything even, or probation, or they can commit them to a correctional facility. Usually those facilities are contracted out, so it would probably be a state facility, but it's not an ideal situation. Under Wyoming law, we have a lot more options in terms of assessing different kinds of options for juveniles. And it ranges from anything to community service to also assessing mental health examinations or other, I won't want to say punishments, but requirements of parents. And so you have a lot more flexibility and options to resolve that conduct without having to be limited to those 3 options under the federal system. So those are the pros. It also, and if we go to the next slide on page 33, concurrent jurisdiction really enables the base and local law enforcement to work together to resolve issues that arise. And there are some particular issues at F.E. Warren that have been challenging for them to deal with over the past few years. One of the biggest concerns that we've been made aware of is the circumstances of Freedom Elementary School. So this is a school that's located on the installation proper. And because it's in that exclusive federal jurisdiction area, there are limitations in how they can respond to threats. There's limitations in who can serve as a police or law enforcement presence in the school. And there have been a lot of concerns about how the response might look for an active shooter situation. So that's one of the primary drivers. Concurrent jurisdiction enables local law enforcement to come into that school and potentially aid in any response and be there a lot more swiftly. And so that's one of the benefits. It also affects law enforcement around the perimeter of the base. So if you've been to F.E. Warren, you've probably seen the very big fence that goes around the exterior, but there are a few little parcels that exist that belong to the base that are outside of that fence line. They're still considered F.E. Warren property. And so there can be limitations on law enforcement for speeding violations or other kinds of infractions that occur in those parcels. So even though it looks like the county sheriff might be able to take care of it, technically, because if it happens on that piece of property, they are not able to do so in a legal manner. Probably the biggest thing that concurrent jurisdiction would solve in terms of a problem set is an effective response to domestic violence and child abuse cases. While these don't happen all the time, when they do happen, the active duty Air Force is really quite limited in how they can respond to it. And one of the typical examples that we'll use is if a child needs to be removed from the home, the Air Force is not in a position to take custody of the child and deal with that situation. Whereas the state has access and has services that are more geared towards those situations. Right now, there's a partnership kind of requirement between the base and local state services that end up taking care of that situation, which is great. It kind of works. It's a little clunky and slow. But one of the downfalls for the state agencies is that they don't necessarily get recognized for that service that they provide within their budgeting and their programming. And so concurrent jurisdiction may open the door to provide that mechanism for those agencies to get reimbursed or programmed for those services that they provide. And then additionally, I think there is an effort to look at expanding parking options for Cheyenne Frontier Days. I think you'll probably hear some more about that. Concurrent jurisdiction is also a mechanism that would make that a lot more possible for the base to support, simply because of the volume of personnel that come onto the property. And again, the limitations that the active duty has in enforcing law violations of law against civilians. So F.E. Warren is manned by security forces personnel. Those are your Title 10 active duty law enforcement folks. We're designed to enforce Uniform Code of Military Justice violations against our military personnel. And while we can certainly take some reactions to civilians who commit law enforcement or violations of law, we're not vested with the same ability to arrest or detain. And so it becomes really challenging if you've got somebody running around and being violent. Our security forces defenders have a lot of limitations in how they can respond to that, depending on the context, right? They can always defend folks, but it just creates a bit more of a mess. And the nice thing is that concurrent jurisdiction opens up those possibilities to bring in local law enforcement to really deal with those offenders. If it's urgent, of course, they're going to respond, but we're talking about things that are a little bit less, immediate urgency kind of things. Hopefully that gives you an overview of the situation. Really, the process that we're looking at talking about today is how is it possible to allow the state to accept concurrent jurisdiction back over the military base? That is through a process that's called retrocession. Really, retrocession just means that the federal government is giving back its exclusive jurisdiction, and they're going to share with the state the jurisdiction that the state initially had before they gave it away. And the reason that we're looking at doing it through a statutory mechanism is because there is a statute, that is Wyoming Statute 19-7-301, that cedes exclusive jurisdiction to the federal government. And there's been a review by the Attorney General's office and an indication that they felt statutory action would be appropriate in order for the governor to accept retroceded jurisdiction. Sorry, it's a mouthful. So the steps of what that looks like is, first, there has to be a statutory mechanism to allow the governor to accept it. That's step one that you'll see on page 34. We've got some sample legislation that we can pass to you, and it's actually relatively straightforward in terms of what that might look like. But once that legislative mechanism is in place, then the next step is that the Department of Defense would, usually via a letter or some other written instrument, relinquish authority or jurisdiction over the base. And they're kind of in charge of what parts of that they would relinquish. So they get to define those terms, and that would be between 90th and the DoD to sort of figure out what makes most sense for them. And then once the governor receives that instrument, he can formally accept that. And then usually in statute, there's a requirement that it be filed with the Secretary of State. Sometimes there's a requirement that it be filed in the register at the local counties for real estate or for property, just to have a record of it. But that's the statutory mechanism. So it's a longer term process, but really what we're looking at is concurrent jurisdiction something that would be of benefit to our population? And is it something that the legislature would support? We have had this discussion a few years ago. And for those of you who recall it, at the time, there was some concern from the Laramie County District Attorney's Office about the impact that that session would have on her workload. We've been able to meet with District Attorney Sylvie Hackle. And what's great is she's very supportive of this concept and recognizes the importance of having concurrent jurisdiction on the base. That said, she does have some concerns about the impact potentially it could have on our workload. But those are things that once this mechanism is in place, we can look at the forecast on the workload that it will have in her office. And then there's mechanisms to help her meet those needs that she'll have based on it. Based on that, that's really just sort of an overview of the issue, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Major. Appreciate it. Any questions? Military Department. Representative Ahern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If this works, if that's what is best for the citizens, both military and civilian around military posts, why hasn't this been changed long ago? And what kind of a process it from the Department of Defense?
Mr. Chairman, and for Representative Ahern, it's a great question. You know, I think there's been, and perhaps the Office of Secretary of Defense might be able to tell you a little bit more about how long they've been pursuing this initiative. It's been quite a while. Initially, we were looking at it, I think, from the standpoint a few years ago as a good thing to do. It's just the concern has always been from the state, right? It's an expense for the state to have to take on some additional law enforcement actions. I think that's always been the biggest hurdle, and we're a small state, and sometimes it's hard to find folks to do that kind of work. The benefit, though, is there for the citizenry, because not only do they have better access to those services, it's better, I think, options for especially juveniles who, as we've talked a lot about today, especially with Cowboy Challenge, the ability to access different kinds of rehabilitative tools is really, really important. And so that's probably the biggest driver. And I think sometimes because it requires legislative action and there's budgetary concerns and it's a long, slow process, it just takes a while for these things to get going. There are states that have done it, and it just sort of varies depending on the climate. In terms of the process from the Department of Defense, I think there is a desire for them, as it's been expressed to me, to wait and see if the legislature is willing to authorize the mechanism. If the mechanism is there, their desire is in fact to release exclusive jurisdiction and allow it to be concurrent. They just haven't worked out the particulars. So there is a document that they will generate. I don't know all of the levels of the various offices that will have to review it. So I think it will initiate once there's a sense that this is an appropriate action. And then hopefully within a year or so, but that's a complete guess on my part.
Representative Pendergraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I gathered from your comments that the county sheriff has no jurisdiction on this federal land. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, and for Representative Pendergraft, that's correct. So they do not. It's exclusive. Only the federal law enforcement can go on there. Now, the exception to that is if somebody needs to have process served on them. There are mechanisms that we can enable folks to serve process on the base. That's done in conjunction with security forces, but it's not the same as going and conducting an investigation or effecting an arrest.
And that's just for something that happened off the base. They have to find the individual that went to the base. It's not like you get off scot-free with anything just because you're on federal installation, right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So service of process is usually for civil matters. So
Right.
for example, if I'm in a divorce case and I live on base, I can't avoid getting that divorce document served on me just because I live on base. So that's
Right.
that service of process.
Okay. Any further questions? Senator. Oh,
Representative Sauer was first. Chairman.
how about you go, Senator?
Well, I'll do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions. First, in a broad sense, a downside besides cost to the base of operations. It's kind of a two-part question. And the second part is just a question about DFS, Department of Family Services. Are they excluded currently from going on base and working with, say, juveniles? Could you help me out with understanding that? Thank you.
Chairman, to Senator Kolb's question, in terms of downside, I don't know that there really is a downside to having concurrent jurisdiction. I think it really is a benefit to everybody. The nice thing about concurrent jurisdiction, right, is that the state always retains the option to become involved in a situation or in law enforcement action on the base, but they're not necessarily like required to do it. So it's almost, but not quite like giving them the first right of refusal. I think I can only think of upsides, and if there are downsides, if Colonel Mabus has an opportunity to speak before you, he may be able to clear some of those up from his perspective. In terms of the arrangement with the Department of Family Services, I know that the base works with them closely when they do have situations involving child custody or child abuse situations. I'm going to let him answer the question in terms of exactly how that arrangement works.
And follow up based off that. So you mentioned that just because we give them authority doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily happen. There's always the option, and that decision-making exists currently, say in the circumstance where an active duty member goes off base and does something stupid, then they have an opportunity, either the local DA can take the case or the military can take the case. So that decision-making happens already in different contexts. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And I think your question makes me realize I need to explain something a little bit more too. With military members, if they commit a crime on base right now, and I'm just talking our military members who are Title 10, that issue is owned entirely by the active duty military. So they're subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If they're prosecuted or investigated, it's going to be handled by Air Force entities and agencies. If you have a civilian on base, right now, there is some investigative capacity, but typically it's really tricky for them, right? And so the prosecution is going to be done through the federal magistrate court and then resolved in that way. Again, that's just for things that happen within the base itself. If you have crimes that occur outside of the base, as long as it's not in those little pockets that still belong to F.E. Warren, if it's a military member, they're now in kind of a dual jurisdiction status. So not only can the military investigate and potentially prosecute them for crimes, even though they occurred off base, the civilian local enforcement can do that as well. So there's a process by which the base and local law enforcement or the attorneys will negotiate to see who's going to take prosecutorial responsibility for those individuals. Civilians off base, that is totally up to local law enforcement.
Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question I have, and I'm thinking about is when this does happen and it's a dependent of an active duty person, how's the chain of command going to react with that jurisdiction? You know, I see that being a problem.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so Representative Stivart, right now, the chain of command has very limited authority in what they can do to handle civilian conduct issues. Really, most often, if you have somebody that's committing misconduct and it's a concern, even if it's a dependent, they can bar them from base. Right? That's almost the extent of what they can do. Otherwise, they're going to refer it to local law enforcement if it's that kind of issue, or engage in other services if it's that kind of solution that they're looking for. So I think actually the chain of command would really welcome the ability to have civilian law enforcement come in and address these issues that are prompting those kinds of concerns.
Right. Follow up, Mr. Chairman. I'm talking about the service member themselves. Because, I've been there and I've seen this happen. There's a dependent's done something wrong, and that service member, their chain of command goes after them. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stivart, I think there's always a desire to make sure that the correct people get held accountable for any kind of misconduct. And so through an investigative process, that's how that would most likely be resolved. Sometimes it can be difficult, and particularly when it comes to families that live on base. If you have an active duty military member with a child, perhaps with some developmental disabilities, who is creating some ruckus on the installation, it is possible that that family member in that active duty military may have to relocate off base, right? But these are the same kinds of authorities that commanders have always had in terms of dealing with conduct and other issues over their families. I don't think there will be a situation in which local law enforcement is going to be called to respond to active duty misconduct, although it does provide that option. And I don't know that there's a mechanism in this to assess your concern in terms of preventing chain of command from holding a military member accountable for conduct that their family member commits, outside of, hopefully they get good legal advice from their judge advocate office and, act in an appropriate way.
Right. To be clear, I don't want to muddy the waters too much. I don't think we can control what happens between active duty members under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Because we have to stay focused. So, but you have a follow-up. So, okay. All right. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Go ahead, Representative. Yeah.
Just a quick question, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the event that a service member might find himself in a sort of double jeopardy, where he's offended the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department, he's also offended UCMJ. Does one law already supersede the other? In other words, does UCMJ automatically come first?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pendergraft, that's a great question. The answer to that is kind of twofold. First off, the Air Force has long had a policy that we're not going to prosecute someone twice for the same offense, even if we could do it under the UCMJ and local law enforcement. So the way we resolve that is through an active dialogue with the local prosecuting office. Different bases do that in a different way. And even here at least in Cheyenne, it kind of goes back and forth depending on the workload of the district attorney's office and the kind of offense that occurred. So it's a process we call releasing jurisdiction. So often the active duty legal office will request jurisdiction over a case. If the district attorney releases it, then they will take over the prosecution. And that can be very advantageous because there are certain offenses that the military may have a few more resources to address than local folks. On the other hand, if it's DUI, sometimes we release it back to the local folks and they're more equipped to deal with that than we are.
So then I gather from what you're saying that there isn't necessarily an automatic UCMJ just preempts local law. It's going to depend on the circumstance. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Pendergraft, that's correct. It is not preempting It's concurrent and it's kind of a negotiation between the state and the federal government.
Any further questions? Okay, appreciate the very thorough overview. I think we got a pretty good idea of what we're looking at here. So looks like the governor's office is unable to join us, which is just fine, actually. Next up, actually, but we do have a member from Warren Air Force Base. So we'll switch up the agenda just a little bit. If Colonel, if you want to add anything, you're welcome to. You don't have to put you on the spot here, but in case you want to add anything to the discussion that you've already heard, feel free to come to the microphone and to introduce yourself and add whatever you feel like is necessary. So go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Kurt Mabus. I'm a Lieutenant Colonel, active duty in the United States Air Force. I'm the senior attorney for the 90th Missile Wing at F.E. Warren. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I understand that there might have been some questions that I might be able to better answer and educate on a couple of those questions. If I can just jump into them, and then I defer to any of the members in front of me. What are some of the downsides beside costs? What I heard. I think some of the downsides, which is also what we were getting at the last question, is maybe a little bit of confusion and required cooperation. Because right now, anything that happens to a military member, anything that happens on our side of the fence line is ours. And that makes it very easy for us to handle the situations that we can handle. But there are certain situations that we're not appropriately equipped to handle. And that's kind of why we're here to discuss that. Will this require additional cooperation with local and state entities? Absolutely. Will it require us to be fully engaged with the local DA? And the answer to that is yes. It does happen already. We have military members who commit offenses off base. The UCMJ obviously applies to all military members wherever they are in the world. So that includes downtown Cheyenne, but then downtown Cheyenne also has an ownership of that misconduct. We fully engage with the local DA, and that applies to wherever the military members are. As for an example of the Department for Family Services, the answer again is we own the jurisdiction and the authority on our side of the fence line. And so local and state entities do not have that type of authority to come on and provide the support that they want to provide. That doesn't mean they don't have the opportunity to. We do try and support that if they're able and willing, but a lot of their policies are going to limit them to handling situations only that they have the authority to handle and not expand their clientele. And so that's some of the limitations that we do see, but that's going to be based off of the individual local and state entity as I understand it.
All right, thank you, sir. Any questions? Hey, appreciate it.
Thank you.
We also have some good work done by our LSO, even though we also had a very good overview from the military department. I'm sure you read your white paper as part of your committee materials. So at this point, if anybody, if Talise wants to add anything that think we haven't covered, now would be the time. You don't have to if you don't want to, but feel free to chime in your analysis of this issue.
Talise Hanson, LSO. The only things that I would just add that haven't been covered, just that to clarify that exclusive jurisdiction that we ceded means that we can serve civil and criminal process and that they have the right to tax. Those are two things that we can currently do, and concurrent jurisdiction they would still be able to do that. Additionally, with everything else that she mentioned, but then the sanctions for those delinquent acts would have to be under state law, dependent on the delinquent act under concurrent jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. So any questions for Elsa? Go ahead, Representative.
I don't know who's going to answer this one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would this create more transparency, more hands-on, and would it decrease the time of prosecution and speed up the process? Or is this going to create another layer of longer trials and longer, all that stuff, i.e. more expense?
Yeah. Anybody wants to take that one?
Maybe
Okay.
from the guy in the back.
Okay, yeah. Mr. Fuller, or you want to try Mr. Fuller?
Mr. Chairman, Representative O'Hearn, you know, the rules about trials, and I'll profess I'm not ultra familiar with the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but I assume they would have a similar speedy trial requirement. The state has a speedy trial requirement required under the federal constitution, required in the rules of criminal procedure. Those won't change. I think, Mr. Chairman, what would change would be the state's ability to even, have the opportunity to prosecute certain offenses and delinquent acts that occur on the grounds of F.E. Warren.
Okay, any further questions from our legal experts in the room? No? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I will open up to public comment. I know we have some folks came all the way up. So anybody who wants to add public comment at this time, now's the time.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Patrick Collins. I'm the mayor of Cheyenne. I really do appreciate this legislative body taking on the issue of concurrent jurisdiction. It is an important issue for my city. As you heard from the team from the military department, there's lots of reasons for concurrent jurisdiction. But for me in the city of Cheyenne, I think maybe the biggest one is the military is our #1 employer. Thousands of jobs, over $700 million worth of economic impact in our community. And when your #1 employer asks for help, I feel obligated to try to help in any way that I can. I know the decisions for exclusive jurisdiction were made legislatively back in the 1800s, 1880s. And I'd hope that we would be able to find an executive or administrative solution to this problem. But as I've read everything, I think I've come to the conclusion the only way to fix this problem is through legislative action. I think that legislative action would give the governor, the city, the county, all of us the ability to work with the military to try to make the right decision for our community. The military base and the city of Cheyenne were born on the same day in 1867. We've grown together and we've become more and more integrated with every year. And today I come to you with the belief that a partnership between the military and our local law enforcement is the preferred way to go. I do have a relationship with the military. I'm a Global Strike Civic Leader and honorary commander on the base. And I've learned that this issue is really important all across the country in military bases and on F.E. Warren. Many states have already taken this action, and I would encourage you to do so today. As mayor, I've communicated with our local police department, our county sheriff, our county commission, our district attorney, our local judges, and our chamber of commerce, and they all are supportive of concurrent jurisdiction. In Cheyenne, we have some significant opportunities before us that can only be realized with shared or concurrent jurisdiction. Specifically, the Air Force awarded an enhanced use lease yesterday, actually. And this would take 75 acres of land outside of the security gate, but owned by the military. And in a public-private partnership would allow us to build about 1,000 housing units in a commercial district that would hopefully suck people off the interstate to pay taxes in Wyoming before they go on to Colorado and Nebraska. But we can't do those kinds of things without concurrent jurisdiction. We have to be able to police those housing units. The legislature, your legislature last year also committed $4 million to help us build a walkway bridge for Cheyenne Frontier Days from Frontier Days to the Air Force Base and an abandoned golf course. This is going to be a game changer for the consumer experience at Frontier Days, but the Air Force isn't going to let us do that unless we have a way to patrol, and concurrent jurisdiction is the way that we need to do that. So I look forward to working with all the players to make concurrent jurisdiction work in our community. And I would respectfully ask for your support and hopefully a bill to do that this January. Our goal is to have that parking area open July 1st of 2024. So we've got to go. The parking that we currently use is the EUL site. So as soon as this fall sometime, they're going to start moving dirt and we won't have a place to park next year for Frontier Day. So it's really a critical timing issue for us. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mayor, did I hear you say that the Air Force abandoned a golf course?
Mr. Chairman, to you, Representative, I'm an avid golfer and it was a heartbreak for me, but the cost of maintaining that 100-year-old irrigation system was too much for them. So they did close their golf course.
I would add that this is, and I would add, Representative, this is the only Air Force base without a flight line too. So it's a few unique things about Warren Air Force Base. So.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate
you,
it.
guys.
That really does help understand the need, especially for, I think most of us visit Frontier Days every once in a while to understand the parking situation. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. So, Mr. Chairman, I might offer that we have a flight line in Western Nebraska and Colorado and Wyoming that you guys attend 365 days a year. So we got a flight line. We can reach out to anybody in the world and,
it's not a flight line,
30
so
minutes
much
or less
better, right?
guaranteed delivery, right? But committee, thank you for allowing me a little time today. I think there's some really important reasons to do this. One of the things I heard was why now? I think perhaps Representative O'Hearn asked that today, but since the time we woke up, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Brown, was nominated to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I have the honor of sitting on a civilian group that interacts with him and Secretary Kendall quite a bit. And one of the things they have really been pushing and have actually made their priority is that we take care of families, right? And this is an excellent way for us to take care of military families and deal with them in a way that's appropriate. And matter of fact, they've even taken this to such a length that they are now judging our communities on whether or not they send us resources and doing basing decisions based on non-traditional items, such as are your education systems effective? Or how are families treated in your communities good? So to me, this is really an important step that we maintain Cheyenne and our state as a family friendly place, and that the military spouses and military children are treated well and in a way that's respectful of that military personnel. I was talking to a retired security forces guy, and I will tell you that the security forces in the nuclear field, for obvious reasons, are some of the most well-trained security forces in all of the United States Air Force. But you're asking a lot of those guys, right? That the same guy that defends a missile site on a pretty small base where they don't have enough to have a kind of a police force, and that security forces group are being asked to do a lot of things, to go out there, defend that nuclear missile site from potential attack, and at the same time deal appropriately with a kid. And I think they do that very well, but I think we can offer some help to them and offer them some backstop by giving some options for how we handle some of those domestic problems with juveniles, et cetera. Lastly, I would just say that, the parking lot for CFD could be a really important thing for us. It really kind of entrenches the future of CFD. I don't know where I guess I started 10 years ago being responsible for kicking them out of their existing parking lot. And it's going to be a great project, but when we disenfranchise somebody, we need to try find an answer. And I think this is an excellent answer for that. And I know some of you are shocked that the Air Force abandoned a golf course, and certainly some of you in the other services can't believe that. But it is an opportunity for us. So it gives us an opportunity to enhance a longtime standing tradition that all of Wyoming is proud of in Frontier Days, and deal with these family problems as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope we continue to move this forward. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, any questions for the Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce? Hey, thank you, Dale. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman,
Uh-huh.
if I may, if the speaker could just introduce himself for
Right.
purpose of the minutes and everything. Thank you.
I am Dale Steenbergen, President, CEO of the Greater Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, so looks like we have somebody online as well. So we'll go ahead and switch to online and then it gives anybody in the room one more chance to come up to the microphone as well. So welcome, please introduce yourself and provide your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tammy Perot, and I am here with the Department of Defense, the Defense State Liaison Office, and it's always a pleasure to be before this committee. Thank you for allowing me to provide virtual comments today on this incredibly important issue to the Department of Defense. I am going to provide a little bit of history that will be a little uncomfortable for some of us to hear, and I want to give a warning about that before I discuss it. First, in 1970, Congress passed legislation permitting the relinquishment of all or part of the legislative jurisdiction of the United States over its lands to the surrounding states through administrative action, a process also referred to as retrocession of jurisdiction. And that is what we are here today to ask you to help us establish for F.E. Warren in the state of Wyoming. This issue, an earlier member of the committee asked about, well, why hasn't this been taken care of before? And although in 1970, this process began to be allowed, it wasn't until January of 2018 when an article was published in the Wyoming Law Review by George Levine, an Army officer and member of the Wyoming Bar, on the importance of establishing concurrent jurisdiction on military installations to protect our children. Major Levine at the time referenced an egregious example where on the base of Fort Lewis, Washington, a 7-year-old boy was raped by a 13-year-old in the wooded ravine near his home on base. And because in 1970, Washington had ceded exclusive legislative jurisdiction to the federal government over the lands that would become Fort Lewis, the state could not subject that juvenile offender to its laws. And the federal system had no process for handling juvenile offenses. This is the story of the egregious cases that we are seeking to protect children from. But as Major Hinkle clearly explained, it is not just juvenile jurisdiction that's critical to ensuring that these cases are taken care of. There are other spaces for there to be concurrent jurisdiction established for. As such, we are asking for this committee to take up the serious obligation of establishing a retrocession process in the state of Wyoming so that we can ensure that the citizens of Wyoming and the citizens that serve on F.E. Warren and live on F.E. Warren are appropriately protected and provided the resources they need for law enforcement as things move forward in the state. Approximately half of military installations currently have concurrent jurisdiction established, and we look forward to working with the state of Wyoming to ensure it is established for F.E. Warren. I stand for your questions.
Hey, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Anybody have any questions for the Department of Defense? Okay, thank you. Good testimony. You have no questions. We look forward to continuing to work with you, Tammy, and appreciate you giving us some insight as to the need for this piece of legislation. So any further comments, public comment? Do you have anybody online, anybody else? Okay, last chance for anybody in the room. Okay, public comment is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Representative Stiver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I request a bill draft be made for concurrence.
Okay, moved by Representative Stiver, second by Senator Furphy. Any discussion? Okay, well, if we can succeed in this, maybe we can work on BLM and Forest Service next. So, you have any, okay. There you go, yeah. But, okay, any further discussion after the web comment? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Okay, good job, committee. We got done quarter after, so we have a little bit of time before I think we supposed to leave at 1500 from Conference County Airport. General, you got any help for us there?
Sir, I'll have Major Johnson come up and just give a quick introduction, but I did have one other final slide. I just wanted to ask some guidance from the committee. There were a couple of other topics that we had talked about that it didn't make it to the May agenda. I just wanted to get the committee's sense. The first one was a funding source for any potential National Guard professional malpractice claims following the last session's. Do we want to get after that? And then the last one was a funding source for Camp Guernsey fire suppression costs. Really quickly, that's state land. And so when we do fire suppression and the folks, our neighbors come help us out, there's currently not a way to reimburse them for that. Of the two, I would say that would be the priority for me to discuss. But if the committee would like it, I would like to come forward in August and just lay the problem statement out and make a recommendation. I also understand that this is a budget session, and if you'd rather not deal with it at the moment, I'm perfectly fine with that too. Just wanted to get your concurrence, your guidance.
Yeah, sure. I mean, those are part of our interim topics, and we're just prioritizing the Youth Challenge Program, frankly. Now that we are well underway on that one, we'll get to that in August. And it's our last chance to get some bill drafts going. So, yeah, and go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think that, do we still have the requirement that we're not supposed to be bringing new bill drafts in the third meeting? Is that right?
I've never heard of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had done that in a few of my other committees, but I just wanted to make sure that we're okay with that. So, because what I didn't want to do is have us get to a situation where we request a bill draft in the second meeting and have it go over in the third meeting. But if we have to amend it substantially, I just don't want to put staff on their heels.
Right. That was part of the discussion I think we had via email was you want the more complicated subjects up front, you know, so in case you need to kick it to the next meeting, you can. That was at least part of my thought process in setting this agenda. And
So you're okay with that, General?
Absolutely. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. Thank you.
Perfect.
Mr. Chairman,
yeah, go ahead.
General, how have we funded fire suppression in the past?
It's come a couple different ways. Part of it has come from the military department. They usually take a chunk of it, but then also the governor's emergency account also takes into account of that too. So that's part of the study that we want to do is kind of give a couple of different options of way we could do it.
We asked the feds to pay for it.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. What is an average fire suppression? I know there's no average because sometimes we don't start fires. Sometimes we do. Has it ever bitten us in the rear end?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, Representative Ahern, if particularly the large fires that happened back in 2011 and 2016, they were, over $1 million in fire suppression costs because it was such a large fire. That's the one I do, but most of the time it's pretty small. We don't go to that. We do mutual aid between the two of us. We work it out, but it's the big issues. It's the big fires that we're concerned about.
We can go ahead, Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What is your history of cost have been about firefighting for this particular situation? What average per year? I realize it doesn't happen all the time, but what's the history? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, my intent is to bring all that to you when we talk in August, but it really is when the big fires happen. And those are usually millions of dollars in suppression that we have to deal with. The stuff that we keep on Camp Guernsey and that sort of thing, that's usually not much of an issue. It's when the big thing happens.
Okay, Mr.
Mr.
Co-Chairman.
Chairman, yeah.
Go ahead.
Committee, what's your pleasure? This one seems to be a pretty easy discussion. We can certainly get into this. My thoughts are, go ahead and get a bill drafted. And for, at least for this one, get this one up and have a bill draft ready to go so we can discuss it and amend it as necessary next time. If the committee is not interested in that, that's fine. But this one seems to be a fairly easy discussion. We would need to have a discussion in the next meeting as to just create an account and then place some money in that. But what's the committee's pleasure on that?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to have a bill drafted on this very subject on a funding source for the campfire or the Camp Guernsey fire suppression costs. Campfire Guernsey costs. Anyways, that's my motion.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, moved by Representative Berger, second by Representative Mahern. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Okay, that motion carries. We'll have a bill ready for us and we'll see what happens in August. No. Anything else?
Nope. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me turn over to Major Johnson real quick and just give us a quick agenda so everybody kind of knows what and where. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Committee, just a real quick overview. So immediately following this, if you need to change, go ahead and change, but need to get out to the Commerce County Airport. It's about an 8-minute drive out north of town here. Once you get out there, we'll have two UH-60s, a Mike model and a Lima model. We'll get you guys split up there. The crew chiefs will take you and escort you out to the aircraft. From there, it's a pretty quick trip to Guernsey, about 20-25 minutes in the air. You'll land at Camp Guernsey where we'll have a bus waiting for you. You guys will be able to use the latrine at the tower in Camp Guernsey, but then we'll take you down to the Sim Center through Camp Guernsey, get you down to the Sim Center where you receive a Guard 101 brief, being that the committee is fairly new, want to expose you a little more to the Guard. General Porter will give that brief along with Chief Moore. Following that, we're going to set you up in our simulation center where you guys will fire rounds and do simulations, and then our beam hit, and it's how our service members qualify and go through the steps to qualify. After that, we will take you back up to the tower. You guys will load up on the same helicopters, and you will fly the North Training Area, looking at some sites. We have some training opportunities out there, so you'll get to view some training areas, our ammo supply points, things like that. Following that, you'll come back to Guernsey. We'll drop off 4 packs, and then you guys should be back in Douglas by 6:15 tonight.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
You have something, Representative?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We get a fly map of the earth.
But that'll be up to the aviators.
Okay, Representative Berger, go ahead.
Can we choose a seat? Can I sit up front?
That I'll leave that up to your committee members.
Okay, we're adjourned.